Great. Thank you. Thanks to everybody. Welcome. I'm Michael Coburn. I've been at Percona a long time. Maybe some of you know me. I was the PMM guy for a while, and now I am a consultant, but still a bit of the PMM guy. Today, we're going to be talking about how you can use PMM to get a little bit more visibility within your environment. I'm going to show some of the common tools that I use when I'm working with customers, different ways that I can give them visibility over things that are happening within their database that aren't necessarily traditional metrics that you get from a status variable. We're going to look at a whole bunch of different screens here, and I'm going to be doing this live. So I will have to try to keep to the time, but I think we'll have a little bit of room at the end for some questions. Please log them through the ticket. I'm sorry, not through the ticket, through the chat, and I'll wrap up what I can towards the end of the presentation. We're going to talk about 4 main ways that you can be involved with PMM. The first 3 are about tools and different ways you can visualize. We're going to look at how you can focus on using custom queries. And because my background is MySQL and not Postgres, and nor is it Mongo, I'm going to focus on MySQL, but a lot of these approaches apply to all of the different technologies. So we'll look at how you can use custom queries, which is a technique of using a select against your data set to render some integers, some numbers, and then I can show you how you can plot those on a graph. A really cool feature. Number 2, we're going to look at integrated alerting. And that's a relatively new feature, which we have in what we call technical preview, or maybe you can think of it as a beta program. The design of this is so that you can get alerts out of events that are occurring within your MySQL, Mongo, or Postgres environment and get them sent to you over PagerDuty, Slack, or email. And we'll go in a quick little way on how you can configure that. My example is going to be using Slack. And the third one, the one I'm probably most proud of and probably the most extensible, is the way that you can make PMM take over your monitoring environment. A lot of you, I'm sure, from larger organizations particularly, but anybody, probably has some measure of monitoring you're already doing. You might have already standardized on a product, and it might be something like Prometheus. Prometheus is an open source project with a very well-known model to how it exposes data. Well, now with these newer versions of PMM and something we call external exporter serverless, you can then leverage all of those installed metric systems out there and pull them into PMM. It's totally awesome. And the last thing I'm going to touch on, how can you get your fixes or your ideas pulled back into PMM? So it's not so much a hands-on there, but it's going to be how do you get recognized for making a difference with this? Okay. So let's just get everybody on the same page. I'm sure a lot of you know this, but I just want to be clear on where we are. We're in version 2, the next major version of it, of PMM, which stands for Percona Monitoring and Management. We've been releasing the software since around 2016 is when we went GA on our first V1. So we're about 5 years into the game. Number 2 was a major departure for number 1. There was no upgrade path. I hope all of you are on version 2. If you're not, I'd love to hear from you through the comments why you might still be on the older version. The point of PMM is to give you visibility first and foremost into your database operations. We didn't try to make this to do anything more than just look at your databases, but as much software grows and evolves, you can do more with it if you want to. And I'm going to show you how, in fact, I use it at home to monitor some things around my home network. It's built on other open source projects. The 2 most important ones are the visualization and where does the data sit? Or sorry, 3 of them. So number 1 is Grafana. It's a very, very popular open source visualization tool. And it's what all of those screens and widgets are when you're using PMM. That's what it is. It's Grafana technology there. Then behind the scenes, there's 2 main databases. Number 1 is called Victoriametrics. We used to use a product called Prometheus, and we phased it out since, I think, about 3 or 4 releases ago. Victoriametrics is a fork of Prometheus with a whole bunch of new bells and whistles. The biggest one, the coolest one, is we were able to convert to a push system. And what that means is no more do we have to do bi-directional communication. Now, on my home network, that was straightforward for me to fix in my firewall. I didn't have to ask my boss or my manager or security team. But for many enterprises, trying to get bi-directional permissions was a big deal. And so we realized that if we could configure for a database server to push everything to the PMM server, so going from a secure subnet to an insecure was much more palatable to the security-minded enterprises we're working with. So Victoriametrics filled that. That's one of their many features, but one that I think has been probably one of the most important and noticeable. And the third one is a technology called ClickHouse. This is a traditional database, but it's a columnar database rather than the Postgres or MySQL row-based database. And the advantage with ClickHouse is you can insert data wicked fast and you can select on ranges like nobody's business. So it makes a really good fit for our query analytics product. So to recap, Grafana sits in front of everything. It's the big visualization tool. Victoria Metrics is when you're looking at numbers and plots of data over time. That's pulling data from Victoria Metrics. And ClickHouse is where we store all of our raw slow query log data from MySQL, for example. Last thing, I'm going to be using 2.17, which was kind of risky. I was going to record this before and use 2.16, but then the guys told me, well, you know, Monday we're going to push a new release for my Thursday call. So I figured, well, let's just ride it fast and loose here. So I'm using 2.17, a couple days old, and it's running great. There's a couple new enhancements in it, and I'll note those as we get to them. Okay, so I mentioned this a little bit just at a high level, but as we dig into it, what do you get inside of PMM? Well, there's two main components. There's the way that I think of it is there's the metrics piece, and that's where you're getting nice data plotted either through dots or lines or this honeycomb system up here on the right, different ways to look at your data from a metadata perspective, right? These are ratios of idle client threads. Well, that means nothing more than I can talk to a database. I can ask it, how many current threads do you have running and what's your maximum threads you have, and do some arithmetic on them. But I didn't have to know anything about the data or the schema or the table names or any of that stuff. I just talk to the MySQL server. I know which variables are there and I pull them out. That's the premise for the bulk of what you get out of metrics, and where we're going to kind of bend it a little bit when we get to the custom queries. But long story short, you're plotting data over time. Okay. The next side is query analytics, and this will look slightly different whether you're using MySQL, Mongo, or PostgreSQL. Again, I focused on MySQL solutions, and what we're looking at is there's two main components to the window. I've kind of structured it, left versus center, but this is not exactly how the screen works. But if you've used query analytics, you've seen it. It's kind of a box on the top right and down the left-hand side. Well, the left-hand side is where you see service name, client host, username. That allows you to use some of the metadata exposed by the logging system to then categorize maybe the queries you want to look at. So in my case, I've allowed it to look at all of the 4 MySQL instances that I have, but I've only filtered it to look at the read-only and the read-write users, and I've excluded a couple other ones. And on the right-hand side, these are the results of my filtering. I'm looking at the sorted load, which queries are taking the most amount of time in MySQL for the user, mSandbox read-only and read-write, okay? A query analytics gives you a great way to understand that bottleneck. And as a consultant, when I go into an environment, I'm finding more and more of our customers are already installing PMM. So I'm able to be productive from the first instant. I don't need to spend any time setting up my monitoring. I'm already accustomed at a personal level with how these interfaces work. And the great benefit is after I leave your environment and leaving PMM installed, if you remain a Percona customer with our support team, they are also intimately familiar with these screens and these graphs. So the more that you can use our tools to report issues makes it more productive for us, the engineers, to respond to your cases. Okay, so that sounds pretty awesome, no? So why do I need anything more? Well, let's get into that a little bit here. Custom queries. First and foremost, you have to know something about your database, or your data set, I should say. If it's day one and you're listening to this, there's probably not a lot of ground you're going to be making up on the company you just joined. But if you're a 3-month or a 3-year or a 3-decade with with your company, you're going to be aware that there are certain tables that are really big, or that there's certain activities, those big jobs that run at night. And when they run, everything gets slow. Maybe you want to know something about something as simple as what's the current count in a table. Okay, if you can express your idea of what you want to track, you can use custom queries. And this whole system exists because there's never going to be a way that Michael, without being as your consultant, or Percona being as one of your service providers, is ever going to know your database data as well as you. So what we do is with that select query, you run it, it exposes some columns and some integers and some labels and things like that, which we're going to get in just a sec. And with that, you can plot them on a graph. Okay. So I took a really straightforward example because the session isn't that long. What I wanted to know was give me a current count of values of records in a table. Okay. In this table, we have InnoDB can give you statistics on it, but it's never going to be as precise as doing a select count star. So what I've been able to do here is I've got a replication hierarchy. I wanted to make sure that they all had accurate counts in this table. And by and large, that didn't always turn out to be true, depending on when things were being monitored. And I was able to do that by plotting these things over time. Okay. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you're doing custom queries is think about how heavy that query is. You want to make sure that it's going to return relatively quickly, and that will dictate what we call your frequency. And the frequency is nothing more than how frequently is this query going to be executed. So just to keep it simple, if you have a polling interval, your high frequency is collected every second, my favorite, and I put it in that category, but the query takes 2 seconds to run, they're going to be stepping all over each other. So just keep that in mind. That's what I see a lot of beginners with this tool. They have a really long running query and it just gets, it doesn't work well for them because it runs longer than the next time the query is expected to be run. So keep that in mind. A query that takes 2 seconds should probably fit into a bucket that's larger than that. In my case, the medium bucket at 5-second frequency. So what do? You write out this YAML format, which is a bit obscure, I will admit, but you write it out in a certain format where you name the metric series, you give it a query. I'm just using a straight up union all so I could get a nice little format out of it. And then you name the columns coming out of it. All I'm getting is the table name and the count that I want to get, or calculating the count of a count of rows. And you need to give it what kind of data that is. So you're going to choose between 3 types. One is the label, which describes it. Then you're going to either choose between a gauge or a counter. A gauge is a value that's able to go up and down. Temperature is a perfect example of a gauge. It's not always going up. A counter is something that is always going to be incrementing. It is never expected to go back down. And that's important to the system to know that difference, because that allows what kinds of mathematical formulas later can be used against it. So suffice it to say, this little stanza here will generate now a new metric series called MySQL SB test count in my in my Victoria metrics database. And then I can plot it on a graph. Okay. If there's enough time, I'll go in and I'll show you. I'll open up each of these definitions of the graphs, and you'll be able to see how I pulled them all together. The premise again, if you have a select, we can help you put that on a graph. Integrated alerting. This is something that we've really only started to introduce in the last couple of releases. So we're calling it technical preview, or think of it as beta, or maybe a little bit earlier than beta. There's a couple things in there that still need some tweaking, okay? But it works. I have it working at home. It's sending it to a Slack channel for me. It's just classic that I've been ignoring a lot of my alerts. I don't know how many of you might get some, and you just look, I'll deal with that later. So what's involved with integrated alerting? You need to enable it first. Then you need to configure some sort of a hook. Out of the gates, again, we're going to use Slack as the example, but you have PagerDuty and email or other options. And then you need to create an alert from a template. That's probably going to be where you'd spend the bulk of your time. The first 2 are just click and done. Number 3 is where you're going to do some initial deployments, and they may be revisiting and tweaking those as you go. And then don't forget number 4, probably do something about your alerts. I'm guilty as anybody for it. I've been ignoring the fact that I'm running out of swap on some of my servers at home, and they just restart overnight. I've been living with it. Shame on me. Integrated alerting needs to be turned on. You go to the advanced settings within PMM server. At the very bottom, there's 3 sections of our technical previews. You want the middle one. You hit integrated alerting, you turn it to the blue, you hit apply, away you go. Then you need to go in to find a notification channel. That's also on the settings screen, but not under advanced setting, it's under communication. You click the radio button over to Slack. I'm not going to go through how you create an app in your Slack environment. Either if you don't know how, talk to your admins for Slack, or it's very easy. The docs for setting it up, even I could follow them. So it's really straightforward to set it up. Basically, it just gives you a long URL in the Slack interface. You paste that in here, you hit apply changes, and then finally, you need to go set up the notification channel within the alerting environment. And you just do that so that you can containerize. You might have more than one Slack channel you want to send alerts to. You might have different teams, right? Alerts that are relevant only to developers versus the DBAs. So therefore, you need to maybe configure multiple channels. In my case, my environment just has one that's called alerts. Okay, now we get into some of the rules. What you do here is you go into the alert screen, and I'll show these. I'll make sure I have enough time to go to these screens to show you it. But here's the high level. On the left, there's this long window. You're going to give it, the very first thing you choose is the template. And we've delivered, to get you started, we've delivered, I think it's 3 or 4 pre-configured alerts for each of the different technologies. So I think there's a dozen, maybe 15 in there for you to play with. And what you're tasked with is these subsequent fields here. You want to give it an appropriate name. I just called it high CPU, but I could be more clever, I suppose, but they're just text strings. You want to give it a threshold. This is what matters. This is what decides as the value goes higher than this number, that's when an alert will be triggered. The next field is called duration. Duration is how long above the threshold do I want this condition to exist before I trigger an alert. And the reason duration is important is you don't want to have transient errors or false positives, because those are the ones that get you at 2 in the morning and you get out of bed and the errors might have already cleared. So we've chosen to use a relatively high value of 300 seconds as the default duration. To me, maybe you could tune that down to 60 seconds, but I wouldn't want to get a CPU alert maybe only over 2 seconds or 5 seconds. That is probably going to clear itself up. So don't get me out of bed for that. Only if it's sustained for a durable period, a significant period, do I care, okay? Then we get into the last 3. Then there's the severity field, and we have 4 different levels. You can go from notice, which is just, hey, just wanted to let you know, versus warning, high, and critical. These are intended to be tweaked on your receiving side. Maybe you can then, in Slack, for example, you can set up different types of ping me when you see critical in the string, but don't send me a middle of the night on notice. So it's a way that you can help categorize whether you want to respond to it. And different people then in Slack can have their own rules around that. So you can be really tuned on a per person basis. Filters, the last box, I'll just show that one over here. So we were just looking at severity. Filters is a place where you can reduce down, because by default, this is going to hit all of the servers in your environment. In mine, with 5 servers, yeah, I probably care if they all have a high CPU, but you might have an environment that has 500 or 5,000, and you might only care about a subset of them. And you only want a subset of those to go to a certain team. So this filters allows you to just kind of break down which are going to be matched. And the 2 common ones in here you'd use are the labels that are attached to these instances. We have one called node name, which is basically the host name of the box, or service name. Those are the service running on a host with yet a different unique string. So using combinations of those can help you really reduce down the blast radius of which nodes are going to be reporting an alert for a given filter type, okay? The last one is channels. Where do you want to send it? I've kept it simple. Send me everything to Michael with no filters. But again, it could be the devs get this on these hosts, dev group 2 gets the, host group 3, etc. You can get pretty tight with integrated alerting here. What does it look like when you receive it? Well, you have 2 ways to look at it. Again, I just focused on Slack, but you're going to have a web interface where you can look in there and go, oh yeah, I can see that there's a high CPU event occurring. It's showing you the severity, and uniquely, I like the labels in here. It's kind of a large window. I think maybe we could do better with the UI of it, but it's important because it gives me some of the other labels that I could potentially be using to filter against, either on my receiving side, some strings to match against, a whole bunch of other things. They're going to be exposed when you receive the alert. You'll also finally, at the end, those last 2 are, I guess, quite important. How long has the alert been firing for, which is active since? And when was the last time that Alert Manager or integrated alerting sent out a notice to you? Okay, these are helpful if you want to be talking to your boss and say, he says, well, why didn't you respond to that? You have something here empirical saying this is when this activity actually occurred. The last one, that little tiny button, I think maybe we can make it a bit brighter, is designed for you to silence this alert. Hey, I got it, integrated alerting. Stop sending me details about it. You don't want to delete the alert, but you want to make it so that it's visible, but not sending me any more pages. Down here at the bottom is why I put in the word, there was a few warts, I think. I think we could clean up this a little bit. One thing I'd like to see is the elimination of the rule ID. To me, that's completely useless. Unless I'm going to match that on a string, the rule ID is only important to back-end computers. But maybe what I would want to see instead is what is the servers that are affected, right? All I know right now that some node in my environment has a critical high CPU load will tell me which one. And also, Grafana has the ability to send to Prometheus an image. And what I love would be maybe the last 5 minutes or 15 minutes of the graph or of the rule that caused the alert. In this particular case, I have a high CPU. I'd love to see the host CPU graph to see, is this going on a lot, or is this like out of the blue? Everything was steady and it went screaming up high and we're staying high. Those are bits of data I think we're going to improve on as we work on our alerting. Okay, but this is what it looks like right now. The fact that you're receiving alert is a really good first step for this tool. Okay, now we have about 10 minutes to go. I should be able to wrap this up in the next 5 to 7 minutes. Custom dashboards and external exporters. You probably already have a fairly large environment deployed, and you probably have a way of exposing them as Prometheus format. If you don't, this won't help you out of the gates unless you start installing a whole bunch of Prometheus systems out there, or exporters, I should say. But in my case, I'll show it assuming that you might have something already out there. And this kind of can become a way of consolidating. Don't try to take over the whole environment, but take over those bits that you want to pull in that just aren't part of the default or the vanilla Percona PMM system, right? This allows you to be a lot more productive with waiting for a feature request to come into us. We might recognize your feature and say we're going to do it, but it's hard for us to give commitment that we're going to do it by a certain release. So this way, I'll show you how to contribute, but basically you do it. You show us how to do it, and we'll take your code and maybe make it part of the product, and we both succeed there. So recently, I've been living in Mexico for a number of years, and having lived in the United States, I'm so jealous and envious of many other parts of the world where internet is just a kind of a given. Low latency, low jitter, and high bandwidth. You just have large pipes. I was able to get 100 megabits 5 years ago, in and out, no problem. Well, I just got that last week, literally last week here in Mexico. So quality of service is a network-based way of classifying your traffic. And I had a 10 megabit download. Great, I could watch a little bit of YouTube, but I had a 0.5 megabyte upload. So some of the people on this chat I've already seen, some of the customers I've worked with, I'm sure had experienced a little bit of the Michael falling into the matrix or him turning off video. We've all been there. It was a very poor experience. So I struggled a lot with how do I deal with this? And I came to Linux. It runs my firewall, and I use QoS to categorize it. I'm saying this because I'm just trying to explain why it was important to me and why I was able to take it on and make it a practical benefit. I looked at other ways to do this. Node Exporter doesn't collect the QoS metrics. I didn't expect it to. It's a bit of heavy lifting. There's some parsing involved. But I found this other monitoring product called Netdata, and it does do that. It also led me to use Netdata, which they call another related product is called Fire QoS. And it's their way of deploying quality of service on your network. So I use that as well. So Netdata and Fire QoS work great together. And I loved it, but it meant I had to be flipping between tabs a lot. And that to no end frustrated me. I wanted to check all of my system activity in PMM, but I had to flip to another tab just to check my quality of service stuff. I know it was a long weekend and we're in COVID. So you have lots of idle time, right? So I had idle time and I took advantage of it. My example will just be representative of what you'd get if you use any other Prometheus endpoint out there, okay? So this is what it looks like in Netdata. Netdata is pretty cool. It gets a whole bunch of metrics about your system. I'm not here to sell them, but it's a pretty sweet monitoring platform. Not as good as PMM, I don't think, but it does do a fantastic job, okay? And what we're looking at here is just some activity of the way I've categorized things. I've categorized my interactive SSH stuff. I've got VoIP. I've got Synapse and some Google activity because I've tried to track which subnet ranges they use. But the point is, I needed to keep VoIP having the highest priority. And the point of quality of service is you give as much to the lower classes as they want, and then everything else gets choked out, okay? So if I have an upload and I'm saturating my upload bandwidth, VoIP should grow to fill that space, and everything else just stalls. My web browsing would probably stop, but ideally my video and my audio still remain consistent. That's the whole point of this. I took that and I pulled it into PMM, okay? So these are from different points in time, like they're off by a few minutes, so the graphs don't exactly line up. But the point is, I was able to take all of that rich data that Netdata exposed and pull it into PMM. And I'll show you exactly how I did that. We're gonna look here first at the URL I fetched from, and what's significant is that it has an API tag to it and some other string components to it. But what's really important is what's the data that I get back. This data comes in the form of a line that begins with a pound sign, so it's a comment, and then I get a line that has a label. I'm sorry, a metric series name, some labels, and then some values at the end. And those values at the end are what's really important and what we pull in here. Okay, so how do you do this? You use the PMM admin command line tool. You tell it to add an external serverless instance, and you can try to pass it all in one long URL, or you can break it up into distinct sections here. I had a problem with the URL in 2.16. I actually didn't try to relaunch it in 2.17. So I had to break it up like this. But this makes it really straightforward. If you're using any other Prometheus exporter out there, obviously you're going to change your host names and your metrics path. Most of the time it's just /metrics. And most of the time it's port, well, each port will be different for each of the exporters. But through this one simple command, you're able to pull in all of that data. When you have it starting to be pulled into PMM, we have a dashboard called Advanced Data Exploration. And this lets you, it creates a metric series for me, excuse me, that I could then inspect before I wanted to create a dashboard. Okay, so when you're customizing dashboards, and then I think I'll have just a minute or two to show you guys the actual screens, you want to be able to develop the graph itself. Of course, you need to come up with a formula, and I use the company's called Telmex here, so I categorized in versus out, and I have it on only on one server, but I used a variable to do it. Basically, this presents that great little chart I used earlier, and I used series overrides quite a lot. I wanted to make sure I used consistent colors. I make sure I wanted to use the same gradients, just so that it looked really pretty and visually appealing to me. Okay, that's number one. Use those series overrides when you're customizing dashboards. They just make it much more approachable to your users. One of the biggest things I hear is, Michael, I looked at my graph today and it was green, yellow, blue, and then tomorrow the colors got inverted, but it was the same metric series names. I can't keep that straight. And it's frustrating when those colors flip. So use those series overrides. Number two, when you're doing custom dashboards, try first to copy our dashboards. They let you reuse a lot of variables that we've presented or created for you. Getting the syntax isn't brutally hard, but it's something you probably don't want to fight with. I forget exactly off the top of my head how to do it. So I find it easier, just copy a dashboard, delete the dashboards, but keep the stuff like the variables there. Also, the query syntax, when you use our dashboards, will give you hints on how you can do better. So my simple one down here on screen is just, there's no sum, there's no average, there's nothing in it, but you can do some rates and some other Prometheus query language modifications to it to plot the data a little differently. I could show the max over times and some other cool features of it. So keeping our graphs, one or two of them, lets you inspect those formulas and maybe use them for yourself. Okay, another way you can be really productive is to go in to grafana.com/dashboards. Now you can search for PMM, but there's lots of other dashboards out there already created. Just go get somebody else's. You don't need to build this yourself. It's straightforward. In the interface, you just click on create, import. You get this ID value or a URL from Grafana, you paste it in, click load, lickety split. 2 seconds later, you've imported a dashboard that works with our system. Caveat, works with our system if it says created for PMM, okay? Try those ones first and just out of the box, boom, it's gonna work. And you're gonna be able to visualize some really cool stuff. Okay, this is an example of one that Peter Zaitsev, our CEO, created a while ago, and it uses Grafana, but it actually queries against the ClickHouse data set. So what we're able to do with this one is actually look at how is the query performance in a MySQL system performing, okay? It's a really neat dashboard. I find if you have any data and query analytics, you should pull this in, and you're gonna find some really awesome characteristics about how your data performs. How has the latency been changing overall? That to me is a really important factor. So you can say to the boss, look, I know the devs are talking about some errors, but query latency hasn't changed. So the databases are pretty good right now. It gives you some real good ammo to talk to other stakeholders within your shop. Last point, I want to talk about how you can contribute to PMM. There's 3 main ways. Why don't you join us on the forums? Forums are a really quick way, free of charge, to ask us a question or answer somebody else's question, okay? It's a really useful platform. It's using, we've just updated it in the last couple of months, and I find it quite productive, and I'm on there a lot too, so I'm happy to answer your questions. Also, if you have a little more of a technical focus, you can jump into doing something directly in our Jira, maybe submitting a feature request or reporting a bug to us. Be aware you're going to be talking to engineers, so we could be very terse, and we're going to be looking for some very raw data and errors, but Jira is your friend. And last, if you want to go hardcore, show us your pull request by contributing directly to our repos. Clone them and push it back up to us. That's the end of the slide deck. We're at the tip of the time. I don't know if we have another minute or not, Katie, or if we end right there. I think they're going to kick me out, but I'm going to keep going until I see myself get shut down. Okay, so I see that there's some questions here. Are there ways to group the databases? Yes, absolutely. I've done that here. Let me see if I can show you a traditional dashboard. Not that one either. I'll put it on one that we ship. Nodes overview. No. Where's MySQL? MySQL instance summary. Okay. When you're setting up the instance is when you need to define. Oh, geez. I love live demos. Let me put it on MySQL here. It's important that when you add the instance that you start to define the things like the cluster that it belongs to. So I've just labeled it migration. On a single server, I'm running multiple instances of MySQL. Now, where can I show these other labels? On perhaps table details or InterDB details. I was looking for one that had more. Okay, I'm going to stop clicking and answer you directly. When you're adding the clients to PMM, you're able to specify environments. So say prod or dev, they're text strings. When you're in adding the service, you're able to say, what's the replication set? What is the cluster name? And these are ways you're already thinking about your app that we don't know about when we're setting up the tool, because it's not necessarily stored in the database anywhere. So you want to educate us about what that app is called. As soon as you do that on some of our dashboards, not the one I'm showing, but on some of our dashboards, they have drop downs that allow you to immediately categorize based on those groupings you've defined. So if you've got 500 in your environment, I know some people I'm looking at who have just answered me questions have that. Well, by using these, look at a cluster that has 15 servers in it through one drop down makes you immediately more productive. It ignores all the other noise that's in there. Okay. Okay, you're welcome. What was the other one I wanted to show? Oh, it was the integrated alerting, and then I bounced off of it already. I think I showed the Slack here, and then going in. Yes, it was the alert rules. So I'll show this really quickly here. You begin with defining the notification channel. I showed these in the screen. So you give it a name, you choose the type out of the 3 categories, and in my channel, it's called alerts. So I called it alerts. Clever, right? In these alert templates, I only focused on the MySQL ones and some of the node ones. So I had maybe 6 for me to play with. When you go into alert rules, I've already defined some, but I'll show you how easy it is. So we'll add one, and we're going to alert at 20% CPU. So we're going to look for the one that alerts on high CPU load. I'm going to say high CPU 20, just some unique text string. And I'm going to change the threshold to 20. I'm going to change my duration to 60, just to make it a bit quicker. And I'm going to say, if it ever gets that high, wow, that's a critical thing I want to alert on. Then finally, I got to say, where do I want to send it? Now, the cool thing is you could send this to multiple locations at the same time. So if you're defining some critical stuff, maybe those are the ones that take a longer duration to get there. And those would include the channel that includes your boss. But maybe the ones before that, the earlier ones, don't include the boss. So you have a chance to deal with it before they get engaged. Multiple channels can be applied. The default is to leave it activated. You click add, and it shows up here. So now I've got one called high CPU 20. And eventually it will show up on the alerts. I've noticed it takes about a minute or two to show up after it gets triggered and actually hit a warning condition. Now, I don't know if any of my nodes actually have it over 20%, but we'll see if they do. I see a question about how to add MongoDB cluster into PMM. You use the PMM admin config, which is the base of any time you're going to interact with PMM. You have to do it in 2 commands at least. PMM admin config will set up the client to talk to a PMM server. So in that case, you're passing, where is the PMM server? What is the username password to talk to it? Poof. Okay. Oh, you can pass in a region and availability zone as well. That's a time that you do it, because that dictates where is this host physically located geographically. And then after that, in the case of MongoDB, you'll run PMM admin add MongoDB, and then a whole host. I think there's about 20 options you can pass to it. In those options, some of the important ones that you need to have are going to be, where is this host located? What port is it on? And what is the username of a valid user to get into MongoDB to authenticate to it? Because we're always reaching in with the exporter to ask it questions. Many of the stuff is set up for default. So if you're running on, I think the default's 27017 for the port. If you don't pass that, it'll figure that out. But if it's non-standard, you need to tell PMM admin that. Okay. Any other questions? Any other things I can help with here? Marco, you're asking a very good question. How do you build the PMM product? Whew, I got the sweats just to reading that question. I've tried a couple times to build it, and wasn't very successful. I think that's an area where we've got some improvements to do. Building the client's a little more straightforward. The PMM admin is a Go binary, but I think you're probably looking more at the PMM server side. All of that build stuff is embedded in some Jenkins jobs, and to me, I don't get into that low level detail stuff after my aborted attempts. So what am I thinking here? I'm thinking I'm going to start up a forum thread. And Marco, if maybe you could DM me or you can DM in this platform. DM me your email address and I'll blip you when I have that forum post created. You can follow it because I'm eager too to have the engineers express how exactly the tool gets built. Right? Because how else can you introduce something into the PMM server side? That's a lot more opaque. That's a lot more difficult. Hard to push as a PR if you don't know how to build it. Where I'm eager about accepting feedback from the community, and then where it's a lot easier is on the client side. Oh, you have a new exporter you want to add, or you have a new dashboard you want to add. Those are really straightforward to be added, and you can really build those yourself. Our builds are pretty complete on the client side. Getting back to the question about do you have to add all nodes in the MongoDB cluster? Yes, there's no discovery of other nodes in a cluster, whether it's MySQL, Mongo, or Postgres. You have to explicitly tell PMM through at least an add service command to say, hey, at this location, there's this thing running, and I want you to set up the correct exporter for it. Now, that's kind of neat because what you could do in some environments is, let's say your shop doesn't allow you to install anything locally. Maybe you're not a given root, or it's too hard to get those darn SREs to ever run anything, the RPM command or the yum command. Okay, what you can do is you can get your own little box, if you're allowed to do that, where you do have root, you install PMM there, and you use the PMM add command, but you do it against hosts that are remote from this instance. And that will let you reach into those ports, those service ports, and source those metrics. So you'll be getting now Mongo, Postgres, MySQL, HA proxy, all that stuff from across the network. Super helpful. The drawback is you won't be able to then see anything about the operating system on the local level. You won't know how busy the disks are. And that's in databases. I mean, that's the classic. Why is my database slow? It's most of the time because the disks are slow. And if we can't see that, then we have a little bit of superstition in us. You know, we're not really sure what the problem is. So it's always best to install locally. But being able to do it remotely by installing PMM client on a dedicated box that you run, connect that to PMM server, and then run a whole bunch of PMM add remote services is a really productive way that you can do it. But you do need to be explicit about naming each of those MongoDB nodes in a cluster. Just flipping through the other tabs here, looking at the Q&A. Okay, the question is about version 2. When do we have alerting? So 2.17 has it, 2.16 had it. I want to say it was 2.15 that we released it. So what that generally means is every month we're pushing a release, or that's our goal. Every roughly 30 days we want a release to go out. So we're talking about 3 months ago is when we first introduced integrated alerting. And it's a big push for us because what we want this product installed everywhere our customers have it. And we get constant feedback on what works for them and what doesn't. And so we're directly motivated to make sure that this product works for particularly our larger enterprises. And monitoring and alerting go hand in hand. We kind of knew that, but we didn't pay a lot of attention to alerting until obviously recently. So we had a release 3 months ago, but that meant we were thinking about it a year or two ago, but we just never really came to fruition. And so we're really trying to put our working gloves on it and make it work properly together. I mentioned some of the warts that I'd like to see improved. If you have your own and you've used integrated alerting, or you just have general feedback on how alerting should work, you can DM me, you can reach me directly. And I have a bit of an inside line thanks to my past experience here at Percona. And I like to work closely with the engineers. So I can help either give you feedback on if your idea is valid or if it makes sense, or maybe different ways that we could shape it. Or maybe we've already introduced a fix to how you see alerting should work. Maybe you just haven't discovered the right button for it. Alerting is dependent on alert manager. And what that means is if you can define an alert manager rule, and they're a bit opaque, they're YAML format. To me, they're not the simplest thing to read, but I'm a big fan of copy paste. You can find these things all over the internet. So if you find an alert rule and it's not working for you, visit our forums, and I'll try to be the first guy to get in there and win some internet points. But really, I care about helping you get your alert working, because frankly, whatever you help me do, I'm going to probably talk about in a subsequent talk and probably reuse that alert as well, just to show as an example of how we work on the forums and how we can improve the integrated alerting product within PMM. Okay, Ronaldo, I recognize that name. Do we have any plans to introduce high availability? Because I'm not the product manager anymore, I can't be making any of those forward, safe harbor, whatever those statements are that the big companies say. So I don't have as tight of a what's actually going to happen as I did as a product manager. But yes, this is a critically important component for us. How can we go into an enterprise shop and say, let me monitor all your stuff, not just monitor it, but I want to alert on it. And then the worst thing I could hear from you would be you saying, well, Michael, last night the website tipped over and I didn't get an alert because my PMM server failed at 12 o'clock and at 12:30 the website went down. I'd melt, I'd probably cry a little bit and say sorry, but realize those are empty words in terms of helping you. So what Percona needs to do with PMM is make it highly available. It's not trivial. There's big data in here, and I don't mean big data like data scientist stuff, but like if you're monitoring 500 nodes, you could potentially be sitting on 2 or 3 or 4 terabytes worth of data. So Percona needs to think about how do we make that so that that data can be replicated and mounted other places and such so forth. How can we make that data available quickly to another host that has to take over? So I don't have any specifics, Ronaldo, on when that's going to happen or frankly even what it's going to look like. I can say the big push for us to get onto Victoria Metrics, one of its other features, is all about being able to do high availability. It has different ways of doing remote reads and writes and other ways of doing these hierarchical cascading. How do you monitor multiple nodes, but only scrape them one at a time and not overload the service you're trying to monitor? But stay tuned for how we're going to actually articulate that and make it into a piece of software. Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions right now. I think at this point, I'll wait another 5 seconds, but then I think we're going to be safe for wrapping up. Please, if you get a chance, there was a link that Katie put in that'll help you rate this. I love the feedback. I like to know the good, the bad, the ugly, and the pretty. I wore a really old Percona t-shirt. I hope you guys can see it from many, many moons ago. And I had hoped to have a nice background, but this platform didn't let me do anything cool. I had some really nice pictures, but anyway, it's a nice green screen anyway. Maybe that made your day. I want to say thanks very much on behalf of Percona and everybody else. Have yourself a great day and stay safe. And I hope your databases keep running healthy.